Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into René Girard's Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World.
Oh, yeah,
It's a dense read, but trust me, it's worth it.
it is.
Have you ever wondered why we want what others have, or how religions came to be? Well, Girard's got some fascinating and maybe even unsettling answers.
What's so captivating about this book is that it tackles these massive questions about human desire, violence, and the origins of culture.
Yeah.
Through this concept called mimetic theory,
Okay.
it suggests that so much of what we think of as our own desires are actually borrowed from others.
Okay, so mimetic desire, it's like keeping up with the Joneses, but on a deeper level, right?
Yeah.
I can see how that leads to rivalry. But how does that explain, say, the birth of religion?
That's where things get really interesting. Girard argues that these rivalries fueled by mimetic desire can escalate to a point where they threaten to tear society apart. He calls this a mimetic crisis.
So imagine a society on the verge of collapse. Everyone at each other's throats because they all want the same thing. What happens next?
According to Girard, this is where the scapegoat mechanism comes into play. It's a bit disturbing, but he suggests that societies often unconsciously find a victim, someone to blame for all the chaos.
So instead of everyone fighting amongst themselves, they unite against this common enemy.
Exactly. And by expelling or sacrificing the scapegoat, they experience a sense of catharsis, a restoration of order. But here's the twist. This victim, through their sacrifice, becomes sacred.
Wow.
They become the foundation for myths, rituals, and even institutions.
Hold on. So you're saying that the very things that hold societies together, like religion and law, are born out of violence.
Yeah.
Directed at an innocent victim.
That's precisely what Girard is arguing, and it's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that this scapegoat mechanism, this act of blaming and sacrificing, is hidden in plain sight throughout human history and even in our modern world.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. So let's start from the beginning. Walk us through how Girard develops this idea of mimetic desire in the book.
Girard starts by breaking down the nature of desire itself. He says that we often think we desire things for their inherent qualities, but that's not the whole story. We actually learn to desire things by imitating others, by seeing what they value.
So it's not that I inherently want that new car. It's that I see my neighbor driving it, and suddenly I want it too.
Right.
It's something, their desire becomes contagious.
Exactly. And this is where things get messy. Because when we imitate someone's desire, we become their rival. We both want the same thing, which creates tension and conflict.
And that makes sense. I mean, think about any time you've wanted something that someone else had, whether it's a material object or even something less tangible, like a certain skill or achievement. There's a natural tendency to compare ourselves and compete.
Exactly. And this competition, fueled by mimetic desire, can escalate quickly, especially when the object of desire is scarce or perceived as valuable.
So let's say you and I both want the same promotion at work. That's a classic example of mimetic rivalry, right?
Okay?
But Girard takes it a step further and says that this kind of rivalry can lead to violence, even on a societal level.
That's right. And the more we imitate each other's desires, the more intense the rivalry becomes. It's like a feedback loop, spiraling out of control.
Okay, so we have this mimetic desire leading to rivalry and potential violence.
Yeah.
Where do these prohibitions and rituals that you mentioned earlier come into play?
Well, as societies develop, they recognize, even if unconsciously, the dangers of unchecked mimetic desire. They start establishing rules and taboos, what Girard calls prohibitions, to try and regulate these desires and prevent chaos.
So it's like setting up boundaries to try and keep the peace. What kind of prohibitions are we talking about here?
Think about the Ten Commandments, for example. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not murder. These are all essentially prohibitions aimed at curbing mimetic desire and the potential for violence that comes with it.
Okay, I see the connection. By prohibiting certain behaviors, societies are trying to prevent the kind of envy and rivalry that could lead to conflict. But what about rituals? How do they fit into this whole scapegoat mechanism?
Rituals are fascinating because they offer a kind of controlled outlet for the very violence they're trying to prevent. They allow societies to symbolically reenact the mimetic crisis and channel that pent-up aggression onto a scapegoat.
So it's like a pressure valve, releasing some of the built-up tension before it explodes and takes the whole society down with it.
That's a great way to put it. And the interesting thing is these rituals often involve a kind of symbolic sacrifice.
Okay, so let's break down this idea of the scapegoat. How does it work? How is the scapegoat chosen?
Girard suggests that the choice of scapegoat is often arbitrary. It could be someone who is different, an outsider, or even someone who is simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be someone who is actually guilty of anything?
Not necessarily. It's about finding someone to bear the weight of the collective anxiety and frustration that has built up due to mimetic rivalry.
And what happens to the scapegoat once they are chosen?
The scapegoat is often expelled from the community, or in more extreme cases, sacrificed. And this act of violence, disturbing as it is, provides a sense of catharsis for the community. It allows them to restore a sense of unity and order.
So it's like everyone is so relieved to have found someone to blame that they forget about their own rivalries and come together against this common enemy.
Exactly. And the scapegoat, through their sacrifice, paradoxically, becomes sacred.
Hold on, you've said that a couple of times now. How does a victim of violence become sacred?
Because the scapegoat, by seemingly resolving the crisis, is seen as having a kind of supernatural power. They are both the cause of the chaos and the source of its resolution.
So they become a symbol of both danger and salvation.
Precisely. And this is where the seeds of religion are sown, according to Girard. The scapegoat becomes the prototype for the deity, a figure who is both feared and revered.
This is all starting to click for me now. So these ancient myths and rituals that we see throughout history, they're not just random stories or practices. They're actually reflections of this primal act of scapegoating.
That's the heart of Girard's argument. He's saying that the scapegoat mechanism is a fundamental pattern of human behavior that has shaped our cultures and beliefs in profound ways.
This is definitely making me rethink my own understanding of history and religion. It's a pretty dark and unsettling way of looking at things, but it also makes a lot of sense.
It can be challenging to confront these darker aspects of human nature, but I think that's what makes Girard's work so important. He's forcing us to look at things we'd rather ignore.
Girard doesn't just focus on ancient societies, though, right? He also talks about how this scapegoat mechanism plays out in the modern world.
Absolutely. He argues that even though we may not have ritual sacrifices in the same way as ancient cultures, the search for scapegoats is still a very real and pervasive phenomenon.
So we might not be literally sacrificing people anymore, but we're still finding ways to blame others for our problems.
Exactly. Think about the way we use language, the labels we assign to groups, the narratives we create to explain complex events. We're constantly looking for someone to bear the weight of our anxieties and frustrations.
You're right. It's so much easier to point fingers and find someone to blame than to actually address the root causes of our problems.
And the dangerous thing is that this scapegoating often targets those who are already marginalized or vulnerable.
Okay, so we've got this mimetic desire leading to rivalry, which can escalate into a full-blown mimetic crisis. Societies try to manage this through prohibitions, but they're not always effective. So they turn to rituals and the scapegoat mechanism to restore order. And from this, religion and institutions emerge. And even though we think we're more civilized now, we're still engaging in scapegoating. Is that a fair summary?
That's a great synthesis of Girard's core argument, but he doesn't stop there. He goes on to explore the implications of the scapegoat mechanism for our understanding of things like language law and even the very structure of human consciousness.
Okay, so there's even more to uncover here. Before we go any further, though, I'd love to get your take on some of the key passages in the book that really stood out to you.
One passage that always sticks with me is where Girard talks about the undifferentiated. He argues that when mimetic rivalry reaches its peak, it creates this sort of societal blur where individuals lose their sense of self in the frenzy of wanting what others want.
So it's like everyone becomes so obsessed with each other that they forget who they are. It sounds a little terrifying, honestly.
It is a bit unsettling. And for primitive societies, this lack of differentiation is a huge threat. It undermines the social order and can lead to complete chaos.
Because if everyone is just a copy of everyone else, how can you have a functioning society? You need distinct roles, hierarchies, a sense of individual identity, right?
Exactly. And that's where the scapegoat mechanism becomes so essential. It provides a way to break this cycle of mimetic rivalry and reestablish differentiation.
By focusing all the negative energy on one individual, the community can reassert its boundaries and regain a sense of order. So the scapegoat, in a way, allows for the reemergence of individual identities within the group.
That's a really insightful way to put it. And Girard takes this a step further, suggesting that even language itself emerges from this scapegoat mechanism.
Wait, really? You're saying that our ability to communicate, to name things, to create meaning, all stems from this primal act of violence?
That's what Girard proposes. He sees the first words, the first signs, as arising from the collective experience of the scapegoat. Think about it. The community needs a way to identify this individual, to set them apart, to explain what's happening.
So language, in a way,
Yeah.
becomes a tool for controlling and containing the mimetic violence that could otherwise destroy the community. It's like putting a name to the chaos and thereby gaining some power over it.
That's a powerful way to think about it. And this idea that language itself is born out of violence is one of the most challenging and thought-provoking aspects of Girard's work.
It certainly makes you question some pretty fundamental assumptions about how we communicate and create meaning. It also makes me think about the role of institutions in all of this. Girard talks a lot about how institutions like law, government, and religion emerge from this scapegoat mechanism as well, right?
Absolutely. He sees institutions as a way of formalizing the process of scapegoating, of creating systems for managing mimetic desire and preventing the kind of chaos that could arise from it.
So these institutions, which we often think of as being about order and justice, are actually rooted in this primal act of violence. It's like they're built on a foundation of blood, even if we've forgotten about it over time.
That's a powerful image. And it gets to the heart of what Girard is trying to expose. He's challenging us to look beyond the surface, to see the hidden violence that underpins our social structures.
It's a lot to take in for sure, but it's also incredibly eye-opening. Another passage that really struck me was where Girard talks about how even in our modern, supposedly enlightened societies, we're still susceptible to the scapegoat mechanism.
That's one of the most relevant and frankly disturbing aspects of Girard's work. He argues that the search for scapegoats is a recurring pattern throughout human history, and it's not something we've outgrown.
And we see this all the time, don't we? In politics, in the media, even in our everyday interactions. We're so quick to blame others, to find someone to make the bad guy.
It's so much easier than looking inward, questioning our own assumptions, or taking responsibility for our own actions. And the consequences can be devastating, especially for those who are chosen as scapegoats.
You're right, it can lead to prejudice, discrimination, even violence and persecution on a massive scale.
And that's why Girard's work is so important. It's not just an academic theory. It's a call to awareness, a challenge to recognize these patterns in ourselves and in the world around us.
Because if we can understand how the scapegoat mechanism works, maybe we could start to break free from it, or at least mitigate its harmful effects.
That's the hope. And I think that's where Girard's work leaves us, with a sense of possibility even amidst all the darkness. It's not about despair, it's about understanding, about recognizing our own capacity for violence and finding ways to transcend it.
This has been an incredibly rich and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for helping us unpack such a complex and challenging book.
It's been my pleasure. Girard's work is demanding, but it's also immensely rewarding. It can truly change the way you see the world.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into things hidden since the foundation of the world. We hope it sparked your curiosity and given you a new lens through which to view the complexities of human nature and the origins of culture. Until next time, keep exploring.